The Donovan family haunting. When darkness came for a child, a 7-year-old girl receives nightly visits from the tall man, until the Warrens discover what he truly wants from her. Long before the names Ed and Lorraine Warren became synonymous with paranormal investigation in popular culture, the couple worked quietly through referrals from clergy and desperate families whose suffering occurred far from public attention. Throughout the 1970s, the New England Society for Psychic Research, founded by the Warrens in 1952, received an increasing volume of requests for investigation from families across Connecticut whose experiences defied conventional explanation. These families came from every economic level and from every background, bound together by the common thread of phenomena they could not dismiss and could not endure. The Donovan family represents one such household. A working family in central Connecticut, they came to the Warrens through the referral of their parish priest, who had visited the home multiple times and found that his prayers produced only temporary relief before the disturbances reasserted themselves with renewed intensity. This pattern, clerical intervention, providing brief respite followed by escalation, was one that Ed Warren had come to regard as a diagnostic marker of genuine demonic infestation rather than simple residual haunting. Residual phenomena were indifferent to prayer. Such hauntings consisted of energy imprints replaying without awareness or intent, like recordings on a loop. Intelligent adversarial entities, however, responded to prayer in a distinctly different manner. They sometimes retreated momentarily before returning in force, as though the prayers themselves were a kind of test the entity was choosing to fail. The Donovan priest's report included specific observations he had made during his visits: anomalous cold in the kitchen despite functioning heating, a pronounced sense of malevolent watchfulness in the master bedroom, and the family's youngest child speaking during the night in a voice and vocabulary that did not belong to a child her age. The hauntings centered primarily on the family's youngest child, a girl of approximately 7 years at the time the most intense phenomena were recorded. The disturbances focused on the upper floor of the family home where the bedrooms were located. The child had begun, some months before the Warrens were contacted, to exhibit behavioral changes that her parents initially attributed to the stress of changing schools. She withdrew from activities she had previously enjoyed. Her sleep became disrupted. She developed a sudden aversion to the family's religious artifacts, including the crucifix that had hung in her room since infancy. She reported to her parents that a figure she called the tall man visited her room each night and spoke to her, telling her things she refused to repeat in daylight. Her parents, concerned but not yet alarmed, initially dismissed these accounts as nightmares or the product of an active imagination. But as the reports continued with consistent detail night after night, and as the child's behavior continued to deteriorate, they began to recognize that something beyond ordinary childhood fears was occurring in their home. Other members of the household experienced parallel disturbances that transformed concern into genuine fear. The father reported waking repeatedly in the early hours of the morning to the certainty that someone was standing beside the bed, though the room showed no intruder when he turned on the light. The sensation was so persistent and so visceral that he began sleeping fitfully, dreading the moment each night when he would wake to that unmistakable sense of presence. The mother described hearing her children called by name from inside the walls in her own voice, an experience she found so deeply disturbing that she slept with the bedroom light on for weeks before contacting the priest. She would be in one room and hear herself calling from another location, summoning her children in tones of urgency that she herself had not produced. When she rushed to find which child needed her, she would discover them confused, responding to a voice that sounded exactly like their mother, but had originated from impossible locations within the structure of the home itself. The phenomena had been sustained for approximately 8 months before the NESBR investigation was formally initiated. By the time the Warrens received the referral, the Donovan household existed in a state of exhausted vigilance. the parents sleeping in shifts to monitor their children, the family's normal rhythms disrupted by the constant awareness that their home had become a place where ordinary rules no longer applied. Ed and Lorraine Warren arrived at the Donovan home with a small NESBR team that included a photographer and a researcher tasked with documenting the family's accounts and the physical layout of the property. This methodical approach characterized the Warrens' investigation work: careful documentation, multiple witnesses, and a systematic gathering of both testimony and environmental data before any conclusions were drawn. Lorraine performed her initial assessment upon entry. Moving through the home in the focused state of heightened sensitivity, she applied to all active investigations. As a clairvoyant and light trance medium, Lorraine claimed the ability to perceive spiritual presences and to sense the emotional and intentional qualities of phenomena that others experienced only through their physical effects. She reported encountering what she described as a concentrated and purposeful darkness on the upper floor, strongest in and near the youngest child's bedroom. The quality, she noted, was not the diffuse, sad weight of residual haunting, the emotional heaviness that sometimes lingered in places where tragedy had occurred, but the pointed, aware quality she associated with an intelligent entity that had established a relationship with a specific individual. In this case, that individual was the child. The entity was using that relationship as its primary point of leverage within the household, accessing the family not through the structure itself, but through the vulnerability of a single member. Ed Warren interviewed the parents at length in the kitchen, while Lorraine sat with the child in the family's living room, away from the upper floor. Lorraine's gentle approach with child witnesses had been refined over decades of investigation work. She understood that children often withheld information from their parents out of fear of not being believed, fear of punishment, or fear of the entity itself, which sometimes explicitly threatened children against disclosure. Lorraine gently drew out a more complete account of the child's experiences than the parents had been able to obtain. What the child described, the nightly visits, the things the tall man had said, the promises he had made, confirmed to Lorraine's professional assessment that this was not childhood imagination, but a sustained, intelligent engagement by an entity that had identified the child as its most accessible point of entry into the family. The tall man, according to the child's account, appeared in her room after her parents put her to bed. He stood in the corner near the window, tall enough that his head nearly reached the ceiling. He spoke in a low voice that she could hear clearly, though she could not remember later whether his mouth moved. He told her that her parents did not understand her. He told her that he could give her things they could not provide. He told her that she was special, that he had chosen her, and that if she listened to him and kept their conversations secret, she would be rewarded. These details, the appeal to the child's sense of being misunderstood, the promises of special status, the demand for secrecy, fit a pattern that Ed Warren had documented across multiple cases involving children. The entity's approach mimicked the grooming behavior of human predators, establishing trust and dependency before escalating to more direct forms of control. Ed Warren's analysis of the Donovan case placed it in the category he considered most urgently requiring intervention, a situation where an inhuman entity had established a primary relationship with a child, exploiting the child's incomplete spiritual and psychological defenses to create a channel of influence into the household. In Warren's theological framework, which drew heavily from Catholic demonology, children were simultaneously among the most vulnerable targets for demonic attention, and among those most capable of recovery when appropriate intervention occurred before the relationship had advanced to the stage of oppression or possession. The Donovan child had not yet reached the stage of oppression. Her personality remained essentially intact, her behavior disturbing but not fundamentally transformed. However, the trajectory, left unaddressed, pointed in a direction that Warren communicated to the parents with careful but unsparing clarity. He explained that the entity's strategy was one of graduated encroachment, establishing trust, making promises, creating emotional dependency, and only then beginning the process of deeper influence that would eventually compromise the child's own will and spiritual identity. The tall man, in Warren's assessment, was not a ghost or a deceased relative, but a demonic intelligence selecting its approach with cold deliberation. The figure's appearance, the exaggerated height, the positioning in corners and margins of the room, the voice that communicated without clear physical speech, bore characteristics Warren associated with inhuman entities attempting to manifest in forms that would be noticed and remembered, but not immediately recognized as monstrous. The spiritual intervention at the Donovan home was conducted with the full cooperation of the family and was led by the priest who had originally referred the case, supplemented by a second clergy member who specialized in the form of house blessing used in cases where an intelligent entity had established a relationship with a child occupant. Ed Warren coordinated the procedural elements of the intervention, ensuring that the child's room received particular and sustained attention, and that the blessing included specific prayers addressed to the entity's identified behavior, its nightly visits to the child, its use of the child's name, and the promises it had made. The rite of blessing, in such cases, was not a generic cleansing, but a targeted spiritual response, addressing the specific mechanisms by which the entity had gained access and influence. The prayers named the behaviors that had been documented. They renounced the entity's claims. They reasserted the spiritual protection that the family's faith provided and that the entity had worked methodically to erode. Lorraine was present in the child's room during this phase, maintaining what she described as a protective spiritual posture while the clergy conducted the rite. She reported that the entity's resistance during this portion of the ceremony was significant. The temperature in the room dropped sharply enough that breath became visible. The child, though held by her mother in another room, became agitated and began calling out in distress. There was a period during which the officiating priest described feeling a pressure against his ability to continue the words of the prayer, not a physical sensation, but a psychic resistance, as though he were pushing against an opposing will that sought to silence him. He pressed through this resistance with deliberate focus, and both he and Lorraine described the resolution as sudden and definitive. There was a lifting, a warmth returning to the room, and a visible relaxation in the atmosphere of the entire upper floor. The child in the other room stopped crying and fell asleep in her mother's arms. The sense of watchful hostility that had pervaded the upper floor dissipated. The Donovan family haunting, while never achieving the public prominence of the Warrens' most famous cases, represents the texture of the investigation work that occupied the majority of their active years. The quiet, sustained, deeply serious response to families whose suffering was real, whose need was urgent, and whose cases would never become the subject of books or films. Ed and Lorraine Warren conducted hundreds of such investigations across their decades of active work, approaching each family with the same rigor and pastoral commitment they brought to the cases that made headlines. The child at the center of the Donovan case recovered fully following the intervention. The behavioral changes reversed in the weeks after the blessing. The nighttime visits ceased. The aversion to the religious objects in her room dissolved as she grew comfortable in a space that no longer carried the presence that had occupied it. She returned to school activities, her sleep normalized, and the frightened withdrawal that had alarmed her parents resolved as she returned to the patterns of ordinary childhood. The Donovan case was preserved in the NESBR case files as a successfully resolved intelligent infestation with a child focus, a category of case that Ed Warren considered among the most important his organization addressed and among the most rewarding to resolve. For the Warrens, the measure of their work was not public recognition, but the restoration of peace to families who had been living under siege. The Donovan family represented one such restoration, their home reclaimed, their child freed from an influence that had sought to claim her for purposes the entity never fully revealed. If you found this case compelling, subscribe to Vanishing Roads for more documented paranormal investigations from around the world. This story was created with AI assistance based on documented case files. All events reference real investigations and reported incidents.